The seeds that grew into the United States, tangled political and military involvement in Vietnam in the 1960s, were sown at the end of World War II. The war had destroyed the old world order. The colonial system, where nations maintained control over other countries or territories, was almost completely destroyed by the war. The United States had emerged from the chaos of World War II as one of the most powerful nations in the world. As the process of rebuilding the world began, America's leaders looked back on their country's successful role in defeating the Germans and the Japanese and concluded that the United States was powerful enough to hold its own against any nation in the world. America's leaders believed the United States should influence and guide the governments of other countries. For the future safety of the United States and the world, every country should develop economic and strategic policies sympathetic to the interests of the United States, these leaders concluded. This ambitious goal became one of the cornerstones of America's foreign policy in the decade after World War II. The spread of communism around the world, however, almost immediately challenged that goal. Communism is a system where all property and businesses are owned by the government. In theory, workers work for the government and in return receive everything they need to live, including a home, food, healthcare, and guaranteed employment. Communism is the opposite of capitalism, in which most of the property is owned privately by people or corporations. One of the principles, or doctrines, of communism is that as the world evolves, more and more nations will become communists. Through revolutions, communism is supposed to eventually take over the world. The spread of communism was perceived by America's leaders as a threat to US national security. Since it was the opposite of the American system, communist countries were not likely to have economic and strategic policies that favored the United States. In addition, US leaders believed in a phenomenon called the domino theory. This theory stated that if one nation became communist, the surrounding nations might also fall, just like dominoes, to communism. If America allowed this to happen, communist countries might take over the world. America's post-war leaders wanted to create a democratic world, and communism prevented that possibility. The Soviet Union had become the world's first communist nation in 1918. The Soviet Union, like the United States, was trying to spread its ideology, communism. Its goal directly conflicted with the world the United States sought to build. Although the United States and the Soviet Union had been forced to become allies to defeat Germany in World War II, after the war ended, the two nations became bitter enemies. The Soviet Union set up communist-led puppet governments in the Eastern European countries it had occupied at the end of the war. This move angered US officials, who wanted the nations to determine their own destiny through national elections that would favor the United States. These two great world powers struggled to get more nations to adopt their ideologies. This conflict became known as the Cold War. Since other nations either aligned with the United States or the Soviet Union, the Cold War dominated world politics. The purpose of American foreign policy was dominated by winning the Cold War through containing the spread of communism. In 1947, President Harry S. Truman announced a new American policy intended to contain communism in southeastern Europe. Truman promised that America would support, through military and economic aid, all free peoples resisting communism. The United States successfully used this policy, known as the Truman Doctrine, to help the Greek people oppose communism in a civil war. The United States also aided Turkey at the end of World War II. These successes helped increase America's confidence that it could reconstruct the world to its own advantage. The spread of communism. The United States also saw communism as a growing threat in Asia, halfway around the world. Korea had already been divided into a communist North and a pro-American South. In China, communists had been struggling to gain control of their country for more than 20 years. In Southeast Asia, communists were working against the established governments in several countries. A similar struggle was occurring between Vietnamese communists and French colonialists in Vietnam. In order to contain the threat of communism, the United States chose to support France in the bitter struggle. Vietnam's struggle for independence. The struggle between the Vietnamese and the French for control of Vietnam had begun long before a communist party even existed in Vietnam. Vietnam had been an important French colony for nearly a century. The French had first established missions in Vietnam during the 18th century. The French ruled Vietnam harshly. In their own country, Vietnamese people were prohibited from traveling outside their districts without identification papers. They were not allowed to attend public meetings, nor could they organize or publish newspapers. They were subject to forced labor and could be imprisoned by the order of any French magistrate. Ho Chi Minh, 1890 to 1969, is the most important figure in Vietnam's long struggle for independence, from the most humble of beginnings. Ho rose to become the leader of his country. He was the architect of the Communists' 50-year struggle to free Vietnam from foreign control. Many facts about his life have been clouded by his secret activities and by his use of aliases, or made-up names, to protect his identity. His original name was Nguyen That Thanh, or Nguyen Van Thanh. He adopted the name Ho Chi Minh, meaning most enlightened one, in the 1940s. Ho travelled widely in his early years, settling in Paris in 1918, the same year the Communists overthrew the Russian government. Ho became a communist, and for the next 50 years worked to free his country from control by the French, the Japanese, and the United States. His life as a revolutionary and liberator was not an easy one. He was sentenced to death by the French in 1929 because of his anti-French activities. In 1930, he was imprisoned briefly by the British, and in 1941 he was arrested by the Chinese on charges of being a French spy. Despite these setbacks, Ho was successful, whereas Vietnamese leaders before him had failed. He understood that the success of any revolution in Vietnam depended upon the support of the Vietnamese peasants. Upon his return to Vietnam during World War II, Ho and his forces set about organizing the peasants. Ho's practicality was another reason for his success. Unlike his predecessors, he was willing to compromise and even make temporary allies of his foes in his quest to free Vietnam. This strategy allowed him to fight on his own terms and on his own schedule rather than on that of his enemies. Ho died in 1969, 6 years before the reunification of North and South Vietnam. For his role in Vietnam's struggle for freedom, Ho is a hero to the Vietnamese people, who affectionately still refer to him as Uncle Ho. Although the Vietnamese bristled under French rule, no leader was able to rally the support necessary to mount a successful revolution against the French. In 1930, however, a Vietnamese leader appeared who would become a key figure in Vietnam's quest for independence. His name was Ho Chi Minh. Not only was Ho a nationalist who favored Vietnamese independence, he was also a communist. He had studied communism in France and the Soviet Union during the 1920s before returning to Southeast Asia. In 1930, Ho helped to unify 3 small communist parties under the name of the Indochinese Communist Party, ICP. The new party's objectives, which Ho drafted, included the overthrow of the French and the establishment of Vietnamese independence. The ICP's first attempt to establish Vietnamese independence met with failure. In 1930, the new party helped organize workers and peasants to protest worsening economic conditions in 2 of Vietnam's provinces. When their demands were not met, the peaceful demonstrations turned into riots. The French Foreign Legion squelched the rebellion in early 1931. Through most of the 1930s, the ICP worked at rebuilding itself. Ho spent much of the decade in Moscow studying and teaching. The struggle against French rule. While the United States was fighting Germany and Japan during World War II, the Vietnamese communists continued their struggle to free Vietnam from French rule. World War II complicated their struggle. In 1940, Japan took advantage of the fact that France was fighting in Europe and invaded portions of Vietnam. Instead of having one foreign country to fight against for independence, Ho suddenly had 2. The Japanese urged the Vietnamese to support them against the French. Although the Vietnamese communists did not trust the Japanese, they used Japan's invasion as an opportunity to seize French-held lands. But France and Japan soon arranged a ceasefire, and the French returned and regained the territories the communists had seized. Ho returned to Vietnam in early 1941, after being absent from his homeland for 30 years. For 3 decades, he had directed Vietnamese revolutionary activities from other countries to avoid being arrested by the French. He set up new headquarters in a cave in the northern part of Vietnam, near the Chinese border. From his new headquarters, Ho met with Vietnamese communists to establish the League for the Independence of Vietnam, Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, or Viet Minh. The goal of the Viet Minh was to defeat the French and the Japanese. To defeat their enemies, the Viet Minh planned to combine the nationalist movements in the cities with peasant rebellions in the rural areas. Ho and the Viet Minh believed it was important to gain the support of the peasants to achieve the goal of Vietnamese independence. In March 1945, the Japanese invaded Vietnam again. This time they revoked the 1883 treaty that established Vietnam as a French colony and declared Vietnam independent under Japanese protection. Ho and the communists, however, considered Japan to be the main enemy and cooperated with the French to get rid of the Japanese. Ho also worked with the United States, providing intelligence information about Japan's war efforts in Indochina. Ho helped rescue American pilots who had been shot down by the Japanese. He hoped that the United States would, in return, support his independence movement once the war was over. After World War II, the Japanese were expelled from Vietnam. But Ho's struggle against the French continued. With France weakened by the World War, Ho and the communists saw their chance. Within days of the Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945, the Vietnamese Revolution began. The Viet Minh soon controlled the northern part of the country. They announced the formation of a provisional or temporary government called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, with Ho Chi Minh as its president and minister of foreign affairs. The Viet Minh were not successful in defeating the French in the south, however. French troops seized control of the city of Saigon. By March of 1946, the French were threatening to retake the northern part of the country from the communists. Ho was able to negotiate a compromise in which France recognized the DRV. In return, Ho and the Viet Minh accepted a small French military presence in the north. The DRV also became a member of the French Union, an organization of France's colonial holdings around the world. Both sides agreed to let South Vietnamese citizens vote in national elections to decide who should lead South Vietnam, the French or the Viet Minh. In December 1946, France reversed its position and demanded that the Viet Minh relinquish control of the north. The Viet Minh instead attacked the French, and war broke out. The fighting continued for nearly a year and a half. The United States chooses sides. It was during this period that the United States became involved in the conflict. Rather than support Ho Chi Minh, as Ho had hoped, the United States instead supported France, its longtime ally. In 1948, France offered a solution to the war in an attempt to prevent further fighting. On June 5th, France granted independence to all of Vietnam in the form of associated statehood. France called the new government the State of Vietnam and appointed former Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai, who was pro-French, to lead it. The Viet Minh were not satisfied with this solution. By setting up a pro-French government and not allowing a leader to be determined by election, the French were still controlling Vietnam. To the United States, however, associated statehood seemed a step in the right direction. Although the United States supported the eventual establishment of an independent Vietnam, it did not want a communist government there. To the United States, allowing France to keep its old colony was preferable to letting Vietnam fall to communism. On February 7, 1950, the United States officially recognized the state of Vietnam. The fighting between the French and Vietnamese continued. With military aid from Communist China, Ho and the Viet Minh concentrated on freeing the north, where the communists were strongest. The communists concentrated on wearing down the French, hoping that the French would tire of the war. They knew that in France, people were growing weary of the conflict. The communists attacked the French military at its weakest points and kept the French forces thinned out by mounting attacks great distances apart. These guerrilla tactics, along with efforts to organize resistance to the French, were quite successful. By late 1952, the Viet Minh had regained control of much of the north. As the communists hoped, the French were tired of the war. They proposed to negotiate a diplomatic settlement, and the Vietnamese communists agreed. But before the peace talks actually began, the Communists decided to attack and hold a French fortified camp to help give them leverage in the forthcoming talks. On March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh began the siege of Dien Bien Phu, a French-occupied town near the Laotian border. The siege ended with the surrender of the French on May 7th, a few days after a peace conference on the Far East began in Geneva, Switzerland. The Geneva Conference was attended by other Eastern and Western nations with interests in the Far East. The United States was one of the Western nations that attended the conference. Ceasefire splits Vietnam in two. In July, the conference produced two documents known as the Geneva Accords. The first was a ceasefire agreement signed by Vietnam and France. It created a demarcation or boundary line near the 17th parallel. The area around the line became known as the Demilitarized Zone or DMZ. The French regrouped south of that line and the Viet Minh moved its forces north of the line. This ceasefire formally divided Vietnam into two separate governments. The part of Vietnam north of the demarcation line was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, and was led by Ho Chi Minh. The portion south of the line was called the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Diem, a nationalist who was anti-communist and anti-French, was named president of South Vietnam. A second agreement called for national elections to be held in July 1956. These elections would be supervised by an international commission. The demarcation line, the agreement said, should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political territory boundary. This meant that the boundary was intended to be only a temporary one. Both the United States and the new government of South Vietnam refused to approve this agreement. Both governments knew that if free elections were held, the communist Viet Minh would surely win and take control of South Vietnam. The communists would gain at the ballot box what they had previously been unable to win on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. U.S. policy after Geneva. After the Geneva Accords of 1954, the United States' goal of containing communism in Vietnam remained the same. But with the French gone, the United States needed a new ally to assist in making sure South Vietnam did not fall. The United States aided Ngo Dinh Diem's government in exchange for his support of the United States. Together, Diem and the United States conspired to thwart the 1956 elections. Diem knew he was a certain loser to the more popular Viet Minh if free elections were held. In the years to follow, however, Diem proved to be a difficult ally and a poor leader. Diem was unable to build a stable government to replace that of the French. He ruled by intimidation and even murder. Popular land reforms established earlier by the Viet Minh were overturned so that Diem and his family could gain more land. Diem's poor rule left the South Vietnamese economy in ruins. US aid was the only thing keeping Diem's government and his policies in force. Though unhappy with Diem's leadership, the United States continued to support him through the 1950s and into the 1960s because he was pro-American. Diem's unpopularity weakened the United States' position in Vietnam. The Vietnamese people began to dislike the United States as much as they disliked Diem. Communists continue the fight. The cancellation of the 1956 elections convinced Ho and the North Vietnamese communists that military action would be required to reunite North and South Vietnam. Throughout the last half of the 1950s, the communists worked to gain support among the people of South Vietnam. In 1960, the Viet Minh changed its name to the Viet Cong, VC. The Viet Cong were successful in organizing the rural peasants against Diem. The Viet Cong also used guerrilla tactics to terrorize and frustrate the South Vietnamese army. Worsening conditions. In the early 1960s, economic, political, and military conditions in South Vietnam continued to worsen. The United States responded, with more aid and military personnel. When President John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, there were only 900 official U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam. By the end of 1962, the figure had reached 11,000. For the next 6 years, U.S. personnel would continue to be sent to South Vietnam in response to ever-worsening conditions. The U.S. military strategy was to help the South Vietnamese fight the Viet Cong. To accomplish this, the United States created a network of armed villages called strategic hamlets. South Vietnamese peasants were moved into the hamlets to keep them separated from the Viet Cong. The United States hoped that this would prevent the peasants from helping the Viet Cong. In a separate effort, US Special Forces, or Green Berets, were sent into the Central Highlands to train tribespeople to support the United States against the Viet Cong. Neither of these two strategies successfully stopped the Viet Cong. By mid-1963, the Viet Cong were so well established in South Vietnam that President Kennedy faced a critical decision. Either he had to commit even more aid to Vietnam or withdraw altogether, which would surely result in a communist victory. Kennedy did not want to let South Vietnam fall to the communists. At the same time, election year was coming up, and he knew that increased aid or military action could hurt his chances at re-election. The domino theory is the concept that if the United States allowed one government to fall to communism, others would surely follow. President Dwight Eisenhower first discussed the concept publicly in a press conference on April 7, 1954, when commenting on the strategic importance of Indochina to the free world. Finally, you have the broader considerations that might follow what you might call the falling domino principle. You had a row of dominoes set up, and you knocked over the first one, and what would happen to the last one was the certainty that it would go over very quickly. So you have the beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. The domino theory was used to justify aid to the French between the end of World War II and their withdrawal from Vietnam in 1954. It was also used to justify support for the Diem government of South Vietnam between 1954 and 1963. President Lyndon Johnson used the domino theory to justify the expansion of US military operations in South Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. Supporters of the domino theory argue that a communist victory in any country lessens US credibility with other small nations threatened by a communist takeover. Critics discount the idea of a worldwide communist revolution and blame the unrest in areas such as Southeast Asia and Central America on conditions that already exist within each country. Late in 1963, before Kennedy made any decision, two extraordinary events happened. On November 1st, the unpopular Diem was killed in a successful coup or revolt against his government. The coup had been organized by Diem's generals. Members of the US State Department had known about the coup in advance and secretly had even pledged US support for the generals. The State Department knew Diem stood in the way of achieving American goals in Vietnam. 3 weeks later, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Johnson became president on the same day. In the hours immediately following Kennedy's death, Johnson wondered if Kennedy had been killed in retaliation for US support of the coup against Diem. But no evidence has ever been found to connect the two deaths. Johnson inherited the critical decision that Kennedy had not lived to make. Should the United States increase its commitment to Vietnam or withdraw? Like Kennedy, Johnson found it to be a difficult decision that was tied to his hopes for re-election. He hoped to put the decision off until after the election, but an incident in the summer of 1964 helped decide for him. Controversy surrounds the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Some critics of the Vietnam War claimed that the version of the events Lyndon B. Johnson gave to the public was untrue. They claimed that American ships had been sent to the Gulf of Tonkin deliberately to provoke the North Vietnamese into attacking them. They also claimed that in the second incident on August 4th, American ships were not attacked, they were only threatened. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, critics charge, was fabricated to give President Johnson the excuse he needed to get Congress to support increased US involvement in the war in South Vietnam. To support their argument, critics charged that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by Congress was written as many as 2 months before the incidents that occurred on August 2nd and 4. If that is true, it means that President Johnson was planning to increase US involvement in Vietnam long before the attacks occurred rather than in reaction to them. It also means that Johnson lied to America during his re-election campaign. During his campaign, he had cautioned against further US military involvement in Vietnam. The complete truth about the Gulf of Tonkin incident may never be known. It is a fact, however, that the incident marked the beginning of the United States' direct military involvement in Vietnam. The conflicting stories over what happened have left the American entry into the Vietnam War clouded in mystery. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2, 1964, the US destroyer Maddox, while on a surveillance mission in the Gulf of Tonkin off the North Vietnamese coast, was attacked by 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats. The attack was easily repelled. 2 days later, North Viet patrol boats again attacked the Maddox and a second destroyer, the USS Turner Joy. Neither ship was damaged, but the idea that the Vietnamese would directly attack US ships enraged Johnson. That same day, Johnson ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese airbases and oil storage depots. US planes flew 60 missions and sank or damaged 30 North Vietnamese boats. Johnson then went before Congress and requested authority to defend American forces in Southeast Asia. The 2 attacks, along with reports that the North Vietnamese army was massing near the 17th parallel for a possible invasion of the South, created a sense of urgency in Congress. In response to Johnson's request, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7th. The resolution stated that Congress approves and supports the determination of the President as Commander-in-Chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Members of Congress were almost unanimous in their support for the President. While the US goal of containing the spread of communism in Vietnam remained the same, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution signaled a significant change. To keep South Vietnam from top-piling, the United States would try and do what the French government had not done and what the South Vietnamese government under Diem had not done. The United States would defend South Vietnam against communism. The escalation of US military efforts in South Vietnam was about to begin.